Today's talk is called Character First, Defining and Methodizing Character Depth. Character depth is a fun subject to look at because we have an intuitive understanding of what we mean when we say a character is deep. But it's one of those terms that a lot of people will stumble through when actually trying to define it. Growing up, I was not an avid reader. In fact, I was a pretty awful one. I think my misunderstanding of character depth is one of the reasons why I was such a bad reader. But I wasn't just a bad reader. I was also a bad writer. Arguably even worse at that than writing, or than reading. I didn't write often because whenever I went back and reread the stories I'd written, my characters just felt super flat. But then sophomore year came along and I read a book called The Catcher in the Rye. I remember one day in the middle of my first time reading this book, my English class went on a field trip. I was about 40 or 50 pages into The Catcher in the Rye at this time, and my English teacher happened to sit next to me on the bus. She asked how the book I'd chosen was going, and I told her I was about a fourth of the way through, and nothing had happened. She nodded and said, nothing much happens for the entire book. She then said that it was still early enough in the process that if I wanted to, I could read a different book for the class, if I wanted to. But I looked at her kind of funny and I told her I didn't mean I wanted to read a different book. I was just really trying to figure out why I loved this one. It hadn't occurred to me before Catcher in the Rye that you can enjoy a book just because of the way the reader interacts with the characters outside of a plot. Shortly after reading The Catcher in the Rye, I discovered something about the way I understood characters that just clicked for me. It transformed characters from words on a page to complex agents with personalities and themes. But I didn't make that discovery in the English classroom. I actually discovered that in a pre-calculus classroom. Before I tell you what that discovery was, though, let's start with the first experience that I, and probably a lot of you, had with the inclusion of mathematics in the English classroom.
Gentlemen, open your text to page 21 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. One, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question one rates the poem's perfection. Question two rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
Excrement. That's what I think of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. We're not laying pipe. We're talking about poetry.
So yeah, there's that. Now, oh, don't play.
Gentlemen, open your text.
There we go, okay. I'm not going to argue with Robin Williams and say that he's wrong in this scene. I don't think anyone would. Poetry, as we all know, is not so simple as a two-dimensional graph. But this scene doesn't just argue against reading poetry in terms of finite values. It argues against the inclusion of math in the English classroom at all. And that's what I would like to challenge. So believe it or not, I'm going to stand up for pig BS a little bit. Perfection here is described as technical prowess of the poem, and importance is, of course, how important the poem is. So let's assume that a poem's so-called perfection and importance are subjective, so that any reader can ascribe a meaning to them. Isn't it true that the more perfect and the more important a poem is to you, the more meaningful that it will be? And isn't it true that a poem that is both perfect and important to you will be more meaningful than a poem that is equally as perfect but not quite as important? All the Pritchard scale really tells us is that the more well-crafted and important a poem is to you, the more meaningful. It's not a deep conclusion by any means, but it means something. The problem with this Pritchard scale isn't that it attempts to use mathematical techniques to describe our understanding of poetry. It's that it models a poem's greatness so constrictively, it gets a lot of stuff wrong. The point of a model shouldn't be that it gets it right. Models in poetry and literature should be used to help us better understand the genre as a whole. As statistician George Box famously said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Writing is more mathematical than we often give it credit for. There's a quote that I love from Mark Danielewski where he says, "Writing is something that's innate. The way a mathematician can reach the ends of the universe without traveling there using the language of numbers, there's a way to reach the ends of the heart and the soul by using words." I would argue that because storytelling is made up of innate methods and techniques, which are not so much created as they are discovered, refusing to apply mathematics to them ignores a deeper understanding inherent in these topics. Models, too, are fundamental to our understanding of literature, specifically when it comes to plots. For instance, there's the famous inverted check mark that we'll often use to understand the rising and falling action of a story, specifically its plot. Another popular model for understanding plots is the hero's journey, also called the monomyth. Joseph Campbell charted the monomyth in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He asserts that a hero's journey can be seen as a circle starting at the top, moving our way through, where the hero is forced to descend into the land of the unknown before they eventually return to their known state, but as a changed person. There's a lot more complexity and nuance to the monomyth that I don't have time to go into, unfortunately, but notice that the inverted checkmark in the monomyth actually respond to one another. Each model in this picture notices that stories tend to culminate in a singular point. It's labeled as the abyss and the climax in the two separate graphs. They also recognize how the story moves, descending into the plot and ultimately returning to a similar state of being, though changed nonetheless. Each of these little details within the model tells us something about the tendencies of stories as a whole. In the article, Forget the Hero's Journey and Consider the Heroine's Quest instead, critic Laura Miller explains that the value of the monomyth is, furthermore, as Campbell would argue, his hero's journey is not an arbitrary storyline chosen to make a moral or political point, but a plot form so deeply embedded in many cultures that we readily recognize and respond to it. So let's go back to character depth specifically. We all have an inherent understanding of depth, but I'd like to posit some aspects of depth that show the general outline of a model. Starting with the definition, the Oxford Learner's Dictionary of English presents two definitions of depth that do a pretty good job of laying the foundation when combined. In characters, depth is defined as qualities that give somebody or something extra character and make them or it interesting. While the dictionary's definition of depth and knowledge is the quality of knowing or understanding a lot of details about something, the ability to provide and explain these details. In literature, character depth is a combination of these two definitions. It's the complex details and rationales of a character that make them interesting. But there's more to it than that. The word depth implies a sort of layering of information. It's not just that we know a lot about this character, it's that these details surrounding characters are buried under nuance, deceit, and subjectivity. Barrick Hockman has a great book for understanding character depth called Character in Literature. In it, he describes the process of how we interpret character depth. He says, in reading character in either life or literature, one moves from level to level, from surface to depth. In moving from level to level, we absorb information that we can use to hypothesize the whole structure of a person's development. So levels are an important part of character depth. Looking a little bit closer at the use of the word levels, I think this is a clue that mathematics may be helpful in how we understand character depth. But for those of you who aren't convinced yet that there's something inherently mathematical, to Hockman's phrasing here, maybe this next quote from Character and Literature will convince you. We register data, relatively raw data, involving human behavior. Even at an early stage, such behavior falls into patterns, which we then check against further data as they are provided to us. On the whole, however, it is only late in the process of perception that we fully conceptualize our sense of characters, or of people, and come to reflect on the dominance or recessiveness of certain traits, or on the relationship between one pattern of traits and another. The result of such reflection is a certain reductiveness. We reduce characters to what we take to be their essential meaning. Hockman's language here, especially when describing the collection of character data, is very mathematical. Notice too that Hockman is implying that there's a hierarchy to the types of data that we collect. Certain character traits are dominant or recessive, he says. Deeper character traits are more influential to a character, while more basic data doesn't carry as much weight or depth. We can see the general outline of a structure here in Hockman's writings. He notes the techniques we as readers use to go from raw data we accumulate about a character to their essential meaning, which we often understand to be theme. However, Hockman is missing two specific details in Character and Literature. First off, Hockman doesn't give us a definition of character depth based on these principles of data collection, levels, and hierarchy of meaning. He points them out for our understanding of characters, but doesn't attribute them as foundational to character depth as a definition. Secondly, he doesn't specifically describe how we collect data, attribute dominance and recessiveness to certain character traits, or categorize separate levels of depth. Hockman only states that we start with raw data and reduce characters to an essential meaning. This implies a method for doing so, but doesn't give us that actual model. So by now, you're probably wondering what specific mathematics I'm going to go into in this definition and model that I'm about to present. What secrets does a pre-calculus class have to hold about characters in a story? Well, let's look at the science. We need something that works in levels. Something that starts with raw, messy data and processes it to give us a better, more fundamental understanding of what we're analyzing. Something reductive, based on trends. As it turns out, all of those descriptors are features of derivatives. Now, for all of you non-math people in the crowd, don't worry. I'll explain it. So, what is a derivative? Conceptually, a derivative is a function that measures the slope of another function that is derived from. Basically, derivatives measure change. For example, if you have a function that gives an object's position, and you decide to graph that equation over time, you can, sorry, I lost my spot here. Measuring the slope of the graph at any point tells you how fast the object is going, otherwise known as the object's velocity. Therefore, taking the derivative of the equation for position gives you another equation that tells you the object's velocity at any given point. Whenever you derive a function, you end up with another function that can also be derived, which leads us to having many layers describing how an object acts, each derivative telling us how the object acts on a deeper and deeper level. On the right side of this slide here, I've labeled some functions and shown what their derivatives should be. We start with a function measuring an object's position, and then derive a function measuring velocity. And deriving the velocity function gives us the object's acceleration. We don't need to go into the specifics of how I'm deriving these equations, but I think it's important to notice what is going on every time we derive a function. Notice that we have more terms in our position equation than we do for our deeper level equations. Every time we derive, the equation gets a little bit simpler. In fact, each term of the equation gets less complex. In our position equation, we've got a variable to the fourth power, while in our acceleration equation, we have a variable to the second power. So the equation itself is more legible, but as we derive, the function becomes more and more powerful. Each term influences the object's position more and more. You don't need to understand derivatives to understand what I'm about to tell you about character depth, but by noticing the same processes going on in derivatives, we can discover things about character depth. So regardless of how math-brained you all are, keep this in mind. Derivatives condense information, generally speaking, for like easy terms like this. The equations get more and more legible as we derive, but what these equations convey gets more and more complex, more fundamental. And doesn't this sort of ring a bell? Let's go back to Hockman's quote. We reduce characters to what we take to be their essential meaning. Derivatives are reductive. They take a lot of raw data and filter it down, condense it level by level. According to Hockman, we should arrive at an essential meaning. This specific equation, for instance, can be derived twice more before we're left with just a singular term. So the question is, if we start with the raw data of characters, the literal words of the text, how many derivatives, how many levels would it take to arrive at essential meaning? Here's the crazy thing. I'm just going to say it's 5. Like, I'm just going to throw that out there, and we will see if that turns out to be right. Character first is what I call the model that all of you are here to see today. Like Campbell's monomyth, it has finite steps that are based off of patterns we can read in story characters. But it also leaves enough room for subjectivity so that the model isn't too restrictive. Character first is also an acronym, as I'm about to show you. We start by collecting the many basic facts of a character and their happenstance in the story as we can. Where does this character live? How old are they? Where do they go to work or school? Note that these details do not describe how a character acts or thinks. The accumulation of these details will show connections from which the character can start to become recognizable. As Hockman puts it, we identify characters in literature in terms of qualities or of constellations of qualities. Recognizing these constellations is what forms our understanding of characters. But we have to start with the basic stuff, the information that does not have a bias or has very little bias. These are the facts. Based on our understanding of the character's facts, we can look at their history and their way of life, and we can pick out certain aspects of their existence that have changed them. These are called insights. This level does away with the aspects of character that aren't really all that important, and points us towards who this character really is. Details on this level are insightful into who characters are beyond the basic facts. Thinking about this level, we should ask ourselves what events and details of this character's existence are most linked to the character's personality and their way of life. Do they have a missing parent? Were they close to someone who died tragically? Have they been revered or successful in a certain field? While facts are objective, we've added a little subjectivity here by deeming some things about a character more important than others. Every time we move from the next level of depth, we will come closer to that character's meaning, but we will do so at the cost of being objective. This happens in any interpretation. But the point is that by building these levels of interpretation, we are basing our meaning off of data and therefore coming to a more accurate conclusion. So insights are those things in a character's history that have most influenced them. Like this model does in every level, we look at all of the information from our lower levels and come to a deeper conclusion about the character. This third level is called reactions because when we look at a character's insights, we notice trends about how the character acts. The difference between this level and the previous is that insights are specific instances, but reactions are tendencies. Think of it this way. Running away from the dragon of Agnar is a one-time thing. However, when you also back away from the dreaded chicken of Bristol and wet yourself at the Battle of Baden Hill, that might just mean you're a coward. And for a quick sanity check, let's just pause and make sure this all checks out. Actions mean more to characters than instances, don't they? And traumatic or more influential events, by definition, mean more than basic facts about them. With all of that in mind, let's move on to the fourth level of deriving characters. So looking at a character's reactions, we start to see rationale for why the characters act the way that they do. This is a character's subjectivity. We are now inside the head of the character, viewing the world as they view it, giving us foundational reasoning for the actions this character takes. For this level, it can be helpful to think of it in terms of first person. I tried to pick some characters that people would be familiar with, so here are two pretty famous examples, I guess. A character like Zuko from The Last Airbender might think, for instance, I must restore my honor at any cost. Since we're in the mind of the character, this analysis can be very subjective. Let's say there are two analysts looking at Darth Vader, for instance, and they're using the character first method, trying to come to a conclusion with it. Basing this fourth level of meaning off of the character's reactions, one analyst may think Darth Vader's subjectivity states, family is the most important thing. Another might say power is the only way to stop suffering. Both of them can be true, and an analysis can certainly include both, but subjectivity often reveals internal conflict, and assigning one of them as dominant might present different interpretations of our fifth and final level of character depth, theme. On the previous level, we explored the deepest parts of the character's psyche. Therefore, looking at our character on the deepest level requires us to leave our character's mind and take a step back, view them as part of a whole. We must take a step back into the world of the narrative and judge how the text itself views this character and their mindset. Doing so derives theme, the fifth and final level of character depth. This is the most subjective level of character, but it's also the most powerful, the most philosophical. It requires our greatest level of interpretation. Take a show like The Walking Dead. Each of these characters may view the world a certain way, and they each have their own subjectivity. What does it mean when they're killed? What is the story saying when it brutally murders a character who is the heart of the group and does so in front of all of their loved ones? Not that that ever happens in the show. Yeah, I cried. What about it? Okay. So, notice that the themes and the subjectivities of a character can directly oppose each other, and that the multiple subjectivities of a character can contribute to just one theme. This is why it's vital that we as analysts begin with lots of first-level facts about any given character to ground the character in the language of the story and prevent our analyses from becoming too speculative. Ultimately, that's what this method teaches us. Much like Campbell's monomyth teaches us how to view a story in terms of a journey, the character first method teaches us how to view themes in terms of a character's portrayal in stories. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned that Hockman's book, Character and Literature, lacked two fundamental pieces for understanding character depth, a definition and a model. So now that we have a model, let's quickly give a character depth definition, excuse me. Character depth is a measure of a character's internal logic within the story, to which can be attributed a large range of complex thoughts, actions, histories, and circumstances. So let's stop and unpack this definition real quick. You'll notice plenty of elements that align with everything I've talked about so far. First of all, I should note that internal logic does not mean logic inside of the character's mind. Internal actually refers to the story itself. This is the last layer of the character first model. Remember that we are in the headspace of the character at the fourth level, the subjectivity level. But then we move into the internal logic of the story itself in our final level. From there, this definition goes through the other four levels, moving from the deepest to the most objective. Thoughts, actions, histories, and circumstances lining up with subjectivity, reactions, insights, and facts, respectively. For a definition, I felt the need to use words that are more prescriptive of what each level requires. But for a model, I use simpler, more concrete terms because if I can't put a pun in my senior capstone, I can at least put an acronym. Now, this is an interesting way of thinking of characters in terms of derivatives and finite layers of meaning and yada, yada, yada. But the model doesn't really mean anything if we can't do anything with it. The point of a model is that it fits data. So let's fit some data. I've told you I like Catcher in the Rye, right? I've read it half a dozen times, and each time that I do, the text itself and Holden Caulfield as a narrator become that much more rich to me. In my opinion, Holden Caulfield is the pinnacle of an unreliable narrator. So I think that modeling him with the character first method will demonstrate the model's effectiveness. But like I said, it's a book I've read many times, so to account for any bias that I might have, I'm also going to show an interpretation of True Grit, specifically the character of Maddie Ross. I read this book for the first time last term and formed my own interpretation of it before consulting any works of literary criticism. But I think you'll be surprised how deep of an analysis this method produces after just one read-through compared to the articles that I found. Also, sorry, but spoilers. Starting with Catcher in the Rye, the plot of this book is pretty simple. Our narrator, Holden Caulfield, is writing the story about his last Christmas. He's been sent home for winter break from his prep school, but hasn't told his parents yet that he got kicked out. So instead of going home, he spends a few days bumming around New York, meeting with friends, old flings, and his cool kid sister Phoebe. I'd say more, but as Holden Caulfield would say, I don't really feel like it. I really don't. Some of the first things we learn about Holden Caulfield seem mundane at first, but will become more important as the story progresses. At the level of facts, we learn about Holden in a very basic sense. He is a tall, 16-year-old man, black and gray hair, who wears a hunting hat backwards and smokes a lot, goes to a renowned prep school, is going home for Christmas, etc., etc. We also learn about his family and his past, which are going to be a huge part of Holden's character. Finally, we get a simple understanding of how he interacts with the world by noting his repeated flunking out of school, his numerous roommates, and his previous non-familial relationships. The biggest concern of our analysis should be the sheer mass of data we can accumulate on Holden Caulfield. However, some of the most important details of the facts level to note are Holden's hunting hat, which he calls a people shooting hat, and Holden's gray hair. Both of these details, though they seem mundane at first, are symbolic of deeper characteristics that will surface later in the analysis. This is why it's important to write down all of the little things, because at the level of facts, we don't know what's important yet. Moving on to insights, we quickly learn that Holden's self-described lousy childhood is more traumatic than it initially seems. His younger brother Allie died young, and Holden recounts, "I slept in the garage the night he died, and I broke all the goddamn windows with my fist, just for the hell of it." Additionally, a classmate of his committed suicide while wearing a sweater that Holden had loaned him. These two events are telling, and the way they are presented will be further explored in reactions. We should also note that Holden is writing this book from a mental institution, which makes the reader question Holden's sanity and further complicates his status as an unreliable narrator, a self-described terrific liar. Deriving his reactions from this, we see how Holden behaves on a regular basis. One important detail to note is that his actions often contradict. For instance, the two extremely traumatic events of his past listed in Insights are played off as part of life, while things like knowing where the ducks in Central Park go make Holden sad. He seems to grieve more for the missing ducks than he does for his deceased brother or his dead classmate. One of the most telling mentions of this comes when his little sister Phoebe asks Holden to name something, anything that he likes. Holden's response is that he likes his younger brother Allie. Not liked, but likes, as if Allie is still alive, which suggests an inability for Holden to process grief. Pay attention as well to the things Holden says he hates: movies, plays, and phonies, and the behaviors Holden engages in, as those statements and behaviors directly contradict each other as well. While one of his foremost reactions is to hate falseness and the establishment, another of Holden's reactions is to be completely disingenuous and to shoot the bull, which is a little less vulgar of a phrase than I would personally call it. This leads us to Holden's subjectivity. Holden is careful to never state his true desires or fears throughout the story, as demonstrated by the opening paragraph of the book. Note, none of that David Copperfield crap, as he puts it. But by the end, we come as close as we will get to Holden explaining his truest beliefs. He says, "Don't ever tell anybody anything. If you do, you start missing everybody." Looking back at the previous levels that have brought us to subjectivity, we start to see that what this sentiment truly means. Holden does not know how to properly grieve, and he feels as if people and events are only worth something in hindsight. He also hates the phony society he's grown up in, but participates in it nonetheless, which seems to show that he wants a better and more genuine life for kids, but doesn't think himself capable of possessing this better life. Finally, this brings us to theme. Knowing how Holden thinks, we take a step back and analyze how that novel interacts with him and his ideas that he puts forth. Since this is a first-person narrative, it can be really difficult to parse out how the novel interacts with Holden. But Salinger does an exceptional job of letting hidden details come across, allowing the reader to identify characteristics about Holden that he can't even identify about himself. Though Holden talks a lot about getting out of his mental institution, the reader is made to wonder how he will do that. What will Holden have to overcome to fit into the world? This phrases the thematic question in terms of the plot. In a more philosophical or thematic sense, Holden's mindset and actions as a character explore the difficulties of adolescence and trauma. Through him, the novel explores the death of childhood, and therefore its significance. The main questions that the novel seems to explore through Holden are therefore twofold. What does it matter if we are only able to care about people after they are gone? And can anyone escape the phoniness of the world? Looking at literary criticism of Catcher in the Rye, we can see that these themes are abundant in analyses of Holden Caulfield. In the article, Holden Caulfield, Don't Ever Tell Anybody Anything, critic Dwayne Edwards writes, Holden focuses on danger and potential death instead of love and a personal relationship. Ultimately, he reveals his unreliability as the narrator for his own life story. Later, Edwards also writes, Holden conforms to phoniness because he wants so badly to join the human race. The character first model and Edwards are clearly picking up on the same sentiments of the book, in that they both quantify his status as an unreliable narrator and use Holden's ironic narration to present a theme about phoniness and conformity. In another essay, Holden Caulfield's Legacy, David Castronovo identifies Salinger's key insight of The Catcher in the Rye to be sentiment and idealism, a childlike faith that life contains more than pretensions and phoniness. Likewise, the character first model picked up on this meaning, questioning whether or not the world of phoniness is inescapable, and whether holding on to childhood can produce meaning or only result in madness. So that's how the character first model works on a book that I've read many times over. But for a true test of its strength, how does this model work on a book that I've never read before? For that, we will turn to True Grit by Charles Portis. True Grit is the story of a 14-year-old girl named Maddie Ross who journeys to a nearby town in Arkansas to pick up the body of her murdered father. Instead of going home, Maddie hires Marshal Rooster Cogburn to avenge her father. They are accompanied by a Texas Ranger who is also searching for the murderer. Though badly hurt along the way, the three of them come face to face with the gang her father's killer runs in. All three survive, but with life-threatening injuries. Years later, Maddie attempts to reconvene with these men, but it is to no avail, and instead recounts as an old woman the novel we've just read. After a single close reading, I was able to pick out quite a few facts about Maddie Ross. The story is not too complex, and our narrator, though not as psychoanalytical as Holden Caulfield, details herself enough that we have a sturdy foundation of who she is. She's a 14-year-old girl looking to avenge her father's death by hiring a U.S. Marshal to track down her killer. As the story progresses, we see that while she is not an imposing figure, she has some impressive argumentative skills. She barters with many of the characters we meet. This is supported by the details we see of her writing to her lawyer, the fact that she is the oldest child, and from the words of other characters in dialogue as well. For instance, Maddie's lawyer tells her in a letter, "Your headstrong ways will lead you into a tight corner one day. You are your mother's strong right arm now, Maddie." In this text, the facts of Maddie Ross can be difficult to separate from the insights. Maddie's narration is concise and matter-of-fact, making the events Maddie is emotionally invested in not much different stylistically from the ones that she is not. The most obvious of these insights is that Maddie's father is dead. That is the heart of the plot and what drives Maddie's story. We learn to see Maddie as a head of a household, though she's only 14. This responsibility clearly weighs on her, and she is also up to the task. Demonstrated by her conversations with a man named Stonehill, who sold some horses to her father shortly before his death. After realizing how capable Maddie is at striking a deal, he says to her, "My patience is wearing thin. You are an unnatural child," he tells her, which is basically the Wild West way of saying she wasn't like other girls. Complementing Maddie's responsibility to her family, we also see the way she interacts with money. Maddie's conversations almost always revolve around payment and debt, whether that is putting the items of life in terms of physical money or putting her relationships in terms of a different kind of value. However, these two values of money and emotional investment do not bleed over, as demonstrated by Maddie's refusal to haggle with her father's corner, despite him obviously scamming her. What this shows is a strong set of reactions in Maddie. She speaks the language of money and economy when interacting with the outside world, but when business gets personal, she does not. We see this as well as with Maddie's refusal to take Tom Chaney's bounty into account when planning his lawful killing. The man must pay, but not in money. As a no-nonsense young woman, Maddie demonstrates her ability to command authority and to fend for herself. But there is also something very clearly missing, a sense of deep personal connection. We can only infer Maddie's sense of compassion based on the lengths at which she is willing to avenge her murdered father. At the end of the novel, when Maddie seeks out her comrades from this mission, who have gone their separate ways, she's unable to find those connections. Rooster Cogburn is dead, and LaBeef, yes, that is how it's pronounced, has left no trail to be found by. With these reactions in mind, we come to Maddie's subjectivity. Her obvious and most prominent motivation is to avenge her father's death, which implies a strong connection with family. She also insists that her two comrades bring her out west with her to allow her to see Tom Chaney brought to justice herself, which suggests Maddie believes it is her responsibility to seek out her father's justice. But most deeply of all, if we mix these understandings of Maddie with her continued economical descriptions of society and justice, a line from early in the novel jumps out and speaks for itself. "You must pay for everything in this world one way or another." The novel seems to view Maddie's sense of the world mostly in agreement. Her and her compatriots' success implies that this subjectivity of personal justice is correct. What's more, the title, True Grit, is what is used to characterize Rooster Cogburn, who is described as one of the most unforgiving marshals there is. This title glorifies the toughness of characters. It serves as a reminder that without the proper toughness to stare down the evils of the world, the heroes would not have succeeded. In fact, it is only despite major injuries to all the characters that they end up succeeding, suggesting a theme of the novel. You must be as cold and as unforgiving as the world itself to claim your justice, at least in the Wild West. But given that the entirety of this novel's plot is centered on the death of Maddie's father, this theme must also be taken in conjunction with the value of family. Family is the only thing that supersedes the value of money. To phrase it as economically as Maddie would, people pay in cash, criminals pay in blood. True Grit is often hailed as one of the greatest novels of its time, perhaps the quintessential Western novel. It's mentioned often in literary criticism, and its name is synonymous with its gritty tone, because grit is literally in the name. Because of this, it's surprising to see articles of literary criticism come up short to the character-first model's interpretation after only a single reading. The author, Arberd Schumann, gives a disappointingly thin analysis of Maddie Ross in Portis's True Grit, Adventure Story, or Entwicklungsroman. He comes to the conclusion that the novel serves to chronicle Maddie Ross's struggle to achieve maturity and sums up the happenings of the novel as the most crucial days of her life, her gargantuan trials. But this interpretation is counterintuitive to what we learn in the novel, and in some places downright false. For instance, Schumann incorrectly states that Maddie is not bitten by snakes, despite this being a major factor in the eventual amputation of her arm. We're also shown that Maddie's ability to barter and to act with grit is not a learned trait. The lawyer's letter states as much when he characterizes Maddie as an almighty trial with headstrong ways. Schumann mistakenly interprets the events of this story as an arc, when in reality, Maddie's story is one of success and bitter fulfillment, not growth. Meanwhile, William Nauenberg's True Grit by Charles Portis recognizes the novel's struggle with wickedness, but oversimplifies Maddie Ross in the themes that she presents. Nauenberg's thesis that the story shows the power of the good to conquer over evil puts into words only the most generic interpretation of any story. Shockingly enough, the themes that really stick out are the ones that the model came to. Honestly, when I was reading and then researching this novel, I was only really looking for the model to point to the same themes as some other works. But the model actually broke some new ground in True Grit's literary criticism, from what I can tell. By the way, my dad made that graphic, so thanks to my dad, the graphic designer. I think it's impressive that such a small model can do so much for our understanding of character depth in literature. I hope that this process makes intuitive sense for all of you, regardless of how involved you've been in reading themes and story characters, or how much knowledge you have in mathematics. And while it may be baffling to think that all elements of characters can be organized into 5 levels of depth, I hope our quick study of derivatives shows just how powerful each advancing level is compared to the previous. In just a few steps, we go from the mundane details of the world around us to the lens with which the story views it. For me personally, this method has been so incredibly helpful for identifying what stories are really trying to say outside of the plot. I hope it does something similar for you. As a writer too, I've used this model in a similar way, relying on the structure to craft characters with deeper meanings and levels of conflicting truth. In my capstone paper, I also analyzed a movie to show this model's effectiveness outside of the genre of the novel. I don't expect this theory to be for everyone, and while part of me wants all of you to think that this theory is as deep as I believe it is, I think what matters more is that we can finally have a concrete understanding of what we mean when we say something or someone is deep. Thank you.
I love this. I mean, I'm such a math nerd, and math onto humanities because it's not an emotional experience. Like, you know, as a fellow math nerd, I'm sure you have this same, like, math is an emotional experience kind of feeling. But is there any reason that I couldn't use this per se to analyze human people? Right, like
in a psychology sort of way.
Right, you know, like maybe I'm analyzing how close I am with a friend by like how much of this I can fill out.
You know, I think that on some level, like, this might work. The problem is in Barrick Hockman's book Character in Literature, he talks about the difference between Homo sapien and Homo fictus, the like fictional character. The thing is with fictional characters, they're built to have an interpretation most of the time. And people are just weird. So I think it works for trying to come at certain themes, but at the same time, people are absurd, and so it might break the model a little bit. Yeah, Owen's first. Yeah.
I just had a quick question. I know that you're sort of coining this as character first, the character first model. I was curious, if some of the definitions you mentioned for character or conceptual depth included objects and I think also organizations as possible sort of targets for these definitions. Do you think that this model, that you explored working with this model as it applies to like conceptual groups or ideas in literature, or is it like primarily geared for looking at characters?
Yeah, I have thought about it. Thanks, Nick. I wanted to do like an analysis where I wanted to get another chance to read Truman Capote's In Cold Blood because the town in that novel, or nonfiction novel, I guess, is its own personality. And so I think that this model could work for a entity that acts as like a character would. I thought about not saying character in this presentation, instead saying agent, just as something that like acts in the spaces of a story. But I think it's more important for this presentation to just think about in terms of character. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what sort of interpretations this could have with like bodies of characters, but I'm sure it could definitely hold some insights there.
Thank you.
Yes, Smith.
When thinking about derivatives, like you just take the equation and apply rules to them and then get something from just that equation, right?
Yeah.
So in your presentation, it seemed like you needed new information in the further steps of the derivation. Is that how you see it, or do you see it as coming all from the kind of facts that you put out?
Yeah. I would say that when I've been doing these interpretations on my own, I will start just like writing down certain things that happen, and in the course of the book, like you'll get certain actions. Like one of the first things that I wrote down for Maddie was that her father was dead, and I didn't put that under facts. I put that under insights right away, just because I figured that's going to be a huge part of her character. I think that, like, from a conceptual level, there are certain areas that certain aspects of the novel will default to. Most often, you will not see like these bottom two levels being said at all in the novel. Maybe like once or twice you'll see the character like actually saying what they like truly believe in, if it's like a well-written novel. But you'll see there'll be tons of like actions that you can put under reactions. And there's tons of like insightful things that you'll find, especially in like really dramatic books, that you shouldn't put under facts because they're just more influential to the character themselves. So I think it depends a lot on the reader, but when you're consuming a story, they should fit into certain areas, not necessarily just the facts. Yeah, Shay.
Wait, is this something that you're taking to use in future things, like with this graphic? You give it to schools to use, or what do we do with this now?
Well, you guys have the knowledge. That's the important part. I don't know. You think I could sell this?
Yes.
I want one.
I
want it with my friends.
I can definitely like send people a copy of this PDF. It's super helpful for me. I've got this one green binder where on the left side it's just like 20 pages of this, and on the right side it's 20 D&D sheets. Yeah, I think that answers the question. Himal?
I guess as someone who kind of struggles sometimes with like identifying the themes, you said you'd like practice like with this. How much did it help like going from subjectivity to like the theme of the novel, like when you use this technique kind of character?
For writing?
Yeah, for like writing or reading of a, like, cause most of it feels like very linear to me, but sometimes like I'll struggle, like even after I look at a book and I go back through it, I can struggle with like the overarching themes. So I was like wondering how much had it helped you when you did it?
Yeah, the way I usually use this is kind of in retrospect. So I'll write certain things about a character, and once this model doesn't really work too well when it's just in the base stages. At least I don't think. But once I've written enough about a certain character, I will go back and try to fill one of these things out and see. I'll try not to instantly put down either of these like last two levels. I'll just see what the first three levels kind of build towards. And if the book is finished, or like if the story is finished, or it is coming to a point where like I know how it's going to end, then I can take what the character thinks and how they view the world and make an interpretation of what the book's theme is based on what their kind of fate is or how they're treated throughout the story. Does that answer everything? All right. Professor Kervin.
So two things. One was I'm not sure, I don't think I know the person who asked you the question about whether this could be used for something other than human characters, but the first thing I was thinking of when you were answering that question, I love the pivot to agents, because I think you could do it for, say, like Richard Powers has trees that, like the trees have many of these same levels of meaning and subjectivity that you could do. So I think it might also be not just humans, depending upon the book. Totally different question. I noticed that the way that you grounded your early discussion of models in terms of literature was in relation to plot, right, with the myth that you were using there, or with the idea of climax. Did you find anywhere in your research models for character, like say in narrative theory or narratology, or anyone who's trying to kind of work out some models that are specifically about character rather than plot?
I over the summer, I was recommended that I look into structuralism. And from that, I got a lot of models about the literal words of the text, the like sign, signifier stuff. And that didn't get as close to as like actual like characters in a story as I liked. I then looked into narratology over the summer, and what I found from that is that it was also looking at story and narratives as a whole. And I wish I could say I researched it further. Like, I watched an entire video series of like this one guy staring at a camera and like reading out lectures for like total of like 5 hours. And what that gave me was a lot of like words and a lot of like literary theory. And I'll be honest in that I'm kind of an engineer of theory. I'm when it comes to like literary theory, whenever someone in class uses an ism or an ist, it just goes directly over my head most of the time. So I think that there's definitely places where like narratology and maybe structuralism too could like factor into this. And I didn't come across any of these specific for character. There is, if I can go back to the Joseph Campbell thingy. There's a slight change to the hero's journey that Dan Harmon made. Dan Harmon created Community and also Rick and Morty, and so he uses a similar structure, but it's a plot wheel, and it basically says that for a given episode of television, you start with the character in a certain position, and they go through 8 different like levels of the episode, and eventually they arrive back at their kind of state of being, but as a changed person. It especially works well for sitcoms because at the end of the episode, everything's supposed to be just peachy. Yeah, does that answer your question?
The reason I asked is this: I was thinking about how just like the schematic or the categorization. It does seem like it's so much more accessible for plot as opposed to character.
Yeah, I think so.